if Mistress Annan had not taken her time about everything. As though there were no Shan-Chen within 100 miles, she lit a lamp on a shelf beside the heavy door and carefully blew out the splinter before replacing the tall glass mantle, then laid the smoking splinter on a small tin tray. Unhurriedly producing a long key from her belt pouch, she undid the iron lock and, finally, motioned him to go through. The stairs beyond were wide enough to bring up a barrel, yet steep, vanishing into darkness. He obeyed, but waited on the second step while she drew the door shut and relocked it, waited for her to take the lead with the lamp held high. The last thing he needed was a tumble. "Do you do this often?" he asked, shifting Jolene. She had stopped her crying, but she still held tight to him, trembling. "I mean, hiding Aes Sedai." "I heard whispers there was a sister still in the city," Mistress Annan replied, "and I managed to find her before the Shan-Chen did. I couldn't leave a sister to them." She glared back over her shoulder, daring him to say different. He wanted to, but he could not make the words come. He supposed he would have helped anyone get away from the Shan-Chen if he could, and he owed a debt to Jolene Maza. The Wandering Woman was a well-stocked inn, and the dark cellar was large. Aisles stretched between barrels of wine and ale stacked on their sides, high slatted bins of potatoes and turnips that stood up off the stone floor, rows of tall shelves holding sacks of dried beans and peas and peppers, mounds of wooden crates holding the light alone knew what. There appeared to be little dust, but the air had the dry smell common to sound storerooms. He spotted his clothes, neatly folded on a cleared shelf, unless someone else was storing garments down there, but he had no chance to look at them. Mistress Annan led the way to the far end of the cellar, where he set Jolene down on an upturned keg. He had to pry her arms free in order to leave her huddled there. Sniveling, she pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve and dabbed at red-rimmed eyes. With her face blotchy, she was hardly the image of an Aes Sedai, never mind her worn dress. "Her nerve is broken," Mistress Annan said, putting the lamp on a barrel that also stood on end, the bung in its end gone. Several other empty barrels stood about the floor where others had been removed, waiting to return to the brewer. It was as close to a clear space as he had seen in the cellar. "She's been hiding ever since the Shan-Chen came. The last few days, her warders have had to move her several times when Shan-Chen decided to search a building instead of just the streets. Enough to break anyone's nerve, I suppose. I doubt they will try to search here, though." Thinking of all those officers upstairs, Matt had to concede she was probably right. Still, he was glad it was not him taking the risk. Squatting in front of Jolene, he grunted at a stab of pain up his leg. "I will help you, if I can," he said. How, he could not have said, but there was that debt. "Just be glad you were lucky enough to dodge them all this time. Teslin wasn't so lucky." Snatching the handkerchief from her eyes, Jolene glared at him. "Luck," she spat angrily. If she had been other than Aes Sedai, he would have said she was sullen, sticking her lower lip out that way. "I could have escaped. It was all confusion the first day, as I understand. But I was unconscious. Ben and Blerick barely managed to carry me out of the palace before the Shan-Chen swarmed over it. And 2 men carrying a limp woman attracted too much attention for them to get anywhere near the city gates before they were secured. I'm glad Teslin was caught. Glad. She gave me something. I'm sure she did. That is why Fen and Blerick couldn't wake me. Why I've been sleeping in stables and hiding in alleys, afraid those monsters would find me. It serves her right." Matt blinked at the tirade. He doubted he had ever heard so much pure venom in a voice before, even in those old memories. Mistress Annan frowned at Jolene, and her hand twitched. "Anyway, I'll help you as much as I can," he said hurriedly, rising so he could move between the 2 women. He would not put it past Mistress Annan to slap Jolene, Aes Sedai or no Aes Sedai, and Jolene looked in no mood to consider the possibility of a Damani being upstairs to feel whatever she did in retaliation. It was a simple truth. The Creator made women so men would not find life too easy. How in the light was he to get an Aes Sedai out of Abu Dar? "I'm in debt to you." A tiny frown wrinkled Jolene's brow. In debt. The note asking me to warn Nynaeve and Elaine, he said slowly. He licked his lips and added, the one you left on my pillow. She flicked a hand dismissively, but her eyes, focused on his face, never blinked. All debts between us are settled the day you help me get outside the city walls, Master Coffin, she said in tones as regal as a queen on her throne. Matt swallowed hard. The note had been stuck into his coat pocket somehow, not left on his pillow, and that meant he was mistaken about who he owed the debt to. He made his leave without calling Jolene on her lie, a lie even if only by letting his mistake pass, and he left without telling Mistress Anand either. It was his problem. It made him feel sick. He wished he had never found out. Back in the Torreson Palace, he went straight to Tylen's apartments and spread his cloak over to dry. A pounding rain beat against the windows. Putting his hat atop one of the carved and gilded wardrobes, he toweled his face and hands dry and considered changing his coat. The rain had soaked through his cloak in a few places. His coat was damp here and there. Damp. Light. Growling in disgust, he wadded up the striped towel and threw it on the bed. He was delaying, even hoping a little, that Tylen might walk in and stab the bedpost so he could put off what he had to do. What he had to do. Jolene had left him with no choice. The palace was laid out simply, if you cared to look at it that way. Servants lived on the lowest level, where the kitchens were, and some in the cellars. The next floor up contained the spacious public rooms and the cramped studies of the clerks, and the third, apartments for less favored guests, most occupied now by Seanchan blood. The highest floor held Tylen's apartments and rooms for more favored guests, like Surath and Tuon and a few others. Except even palaces had attics, of a sort. Pausing at the foot of a flight of stairs hidden around an innocuous corner where they would not be noticed, Matt drew a deep breath before going up slowly. The huge windowless room at the top of the stairs, low ceiling and floored with rough planks, had been cleared of whatever it held before the Seanchan, and the space filled with a grid of tiny wooden rooms, each with its own closed door. Pale iron stand lamps lit the narrow halls between. The rain beating down on the roof tiles was loud here, just overhead. He paused again on the top step, and only breathed again when he realized that he could hear no footsteps. A woman was crying in one of the tiny rooms, but no Suldam was going to appear and demand to know what he was doing there. Likely, they would learn he had been, but not until after he found out what he needed, if he was quick. He did not know which room was hers, was the trouble. He walked to the first and opened the door long enough to peek in. An Afa'an Mier woman in a gray dress was sitting on the side of a narrow bed, hands folded in her lap. The bed and a washstand, with bowl and pitcher and a tiny mirror, took up most of the room. Several gray dresses hung from pegs on the wall. The segmented silver leash of an idam ran in an arc from the silver collar around her neck to a silver bracelet looped over a hook set in the wall. She could reach any part of the tiny room. The small holes where her earrings and nose ring had been had not yet had time to heal. They looked like wounds. When the door opened, her head came up with a fearful expression that faded into speculation, and maybe hope. He closed the door without saying a word. I can't save all of them, he thought harshly. I can't. Liked what he hated there. The next doors revealed identical rooms and 3 more seafolk women, one of them weeping loudly on her bed, and then a sleeping yellow-haired woman, all with her eye down loosely stretched to hooks. He eased that door shut as though he were trying to filch one of Mistress Alvere's pies right under her nose. Maybe the yellow-haired woman was not Seanchan, but he was not about to take the chance. A dozen doors later, he exhaled heavily in relief and slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind him. Teslin Baradin lay on the bed, her face pillowed on her hands. Only her dark eyes moved, stabbing at him. She said nothing, just looked at him as though trying to bore holes in his skull. You put a note In my coat pocket, he said softly. The walls were thin. He could still hear the weeping woman. Why? Elida does want those girls as much as she ever wanted the staff and stool, Teslin said simply, without moving. Her voice still had harshness to it, but less than he recalled. Especially Elaine. I did wish to inconvenience Elida if I could. Let her whistle for them. She gave a soft laugh, tinged with bitterness. I did even dose Jolene with fork root, so she could know those girls. And look what it did get me. Jolene did escape, and I... Her eyes moved again to the silver bracelet hanging on the hook. Sighing, Matt leaned against the wall beside the dresses, hanging on pegs. She knew what had been in the note, a warning for Elaine and Nynaeve. Light, but he had hoped she would not, that someone else had put the bloody thing in his pocket. It had not done any good anyway. They both knew Elida was after them. The note had changed nothing. The woman had not really been trying to help them anyway, just to inconvenience Elida. He could walk away with a clean conscience. Blood and ashes. He should never actually have spoken to her. Now that he had actually exchanged words with her. I'll try to help you escape if I can, he said reluctantly. She remained still on the bed. Neither her expression nor her tone of voice changed. She might have been explaining something simple and unimportant. Even if you can remove the color, I will not get very far. Perhaps no even out of the palace. And if I do, no woman who can channel can walk through the city gates unless she does wear an idam. I have stood guard there myself, and I do know. I'll figure out something, he muttered, raking his fingers through his hair. Figure out something? What? Light, you don't even sound as if you want to escape. You do be serious, she whispered, so low he nearly did not hear. I did think you only did come to taunt me. Slowly she sat, swinging her feet down to the floor. Her eyes latched onto his intently, and her voice took on a low urgency. Do I want to escape? When I do something that does please them, the Suldam, do give me sweets. I do find myself looking forward to those rewards. Breathy horror crept into her voice. Not for lacking of sweets, but because I have pleased the Suldam. A single tear trickled from her eye. She inhaled deeply. If you do help me escape, I will do anything you ask of me that does not encompass treason to the white. Her teeth snapped shut, and she sat up straight, staring right through him. Abruptly, she nodded to herself. Help me escape, and I will do anything you ask of me, she said. I will do what I can, he told her. I must think of a way. She nodded as though he had promised an escape by nightfall. There do be another sister held prisoner here in the palace. Edesina Azedin. She must come with us. One other, Matt said. I thought I'd seen 3 or 4, counting you. Anyway, I'm not sure I can get you out, much less the others do be changed. Teslin's mouth tightened. Guisin and Mylan, I did know her as Shireen Caminel, but she do answer only to Mylan now. Those 2 would betray us. Edesina do still be herself. I will no leave her behind, even if she do be a rebel. Now look, Matt said with a smile, soothingly. I said I will try to get you out, but I can't see any way to get 2 of you. It do be best if you go now, she broke in again. Men are no allowed up here. And in any case, you will rouse suspicions if you do be found. Frowning at him, she sniffed. It would help if you did not dress so flamboyantly. 10 drunken tinkers could not attract as much attention as you do. Go now. Quickly. Go. He went, muttering to himself. Just like an Aes Sedai, offered to help her, and the next thing you knew, she had you scaling a sheer cliff in the middle of the night to break 50 people out of a dungeon by yourself. That had been another man, a long time dead, but he remembered it, and it fit. Blood and bloody ashes. He did not know how to rescue one Aes Sedai, and she had him trying to rescue two. He stalked around the innocuous corner at the foot of the stairs, and almost walked into Tuon. The money kennels are forbidden to men, she said, peering up at him coldly through her veil. You could be punished just for entering. I was looking for a windfinder, High Lady, he said hastily, making a leg and thinking as fast as he ever had in his life. She did me a favor once, and I thought she might like something from the kitchens. Some pastries or the like. I didn't see her, though. I suppose she wasn't caught when... He trailed off, staring. The stern, judicial mask the girl always wore for a face had melted into a smile. She really was beautiful. That is very kind of you, she said. It's good to know you are kind to the money. But you must be careful. There are men who actually take the money to their beds. Her full mouth twisted in disgust. You would not want anyone to think you are perverted. That severe expression settled on her face again. All prisoners would be executed immediately. Thank you for the warning, High Lady, he said, a little unsteadily. What kind of a man wanted to bet a woman who was on a leash? He disappeared then, as far as she was concerned. She just glided away down the hall as if she saw no one. For once, though, the High Lady Tuon did not concern him at all. He had an Aes Sedai hiding in the cellar of the Wandering Woman, and two wearing Damani leashes, who all expected Matt Bloody Coffin to save their necks. He was sure Teslin would inform this Edicina all about it as soon as she was able. 3 women who might start getting impatient if he failed to waft them to safety soon enough. Women liked to talk, and when they talked enough, they let slip things better left unspoken. Impatient women talked even more than the rest. He could not feel the dice in his head, but he could almost hear a clock ticking, and the hour might be struck by a headsman's axe. Battles he could plan in his sleep, but those old memories did not seem much help here. He needed a schemer, someone used to plotting and crooked ways of thinking. It was time to make Tom sit down and talk. And Julian. Setting out in search of either, he unconsciously began humming I'm Down at the Bottom of the Well. Well, he was, and night was falling, and the rain well and truly coming down. As often happened, another name drifted up out of those old memories. A song of the court of Takedo, in Farashel, crushed 1,000 years ago and more by Arthur Hawkwing. The intervening years had made remarkably little change in the tune itself, though. Then it had been called The Last Stand at Mandenhar. Either way, it fit too bloody well.
Chapter 20. Questions of Treason. Climbing to the cramped kennels at the very top of the Tarasin Palace, Bethamin held her writing board carefully. Sometimes the ink jar's cork came loose, and ink spots were difficult to remove from clothing. She kept herself as presentable at all times as if she had been called to appear before one of the high blood. She did not talk to Rena, who had the inspection duty with her today, as they walked up the stairs. They were supposed to be doing an assigned task, not chattering idly. That was part of her reason. Where others jockeyed to be complete with their favorite Damani, and goggled at the strange sights of this land, and speculated on the rewards to be gained here, she focused on her duties, asking for the most difficult Marath Damani to tame to the Idam, working twice as hard and twice as long as anyone else. The rain had stopped, finally, leaving the kennels in silence. The Damani would get some exercise at least today. Most grew sulky if confined to the kennels too long, and these makeshift kennels were decidedly confining. But regrettably, she was not assigned to walking today. Rena never was, though once she had been Suroth's best trainer. and well respected. A little harsh sometimes, but highly skilled. Once everyone had said she would soon be made der Soldaten, in spite of her youth. Matters had changed. There were always more Soldaten than Damani, yet no one could recall Rena being complete since Falma, her or Sita, whom Suroth had taken into personal service after Falma. Bethamin enjoyed gossiping over wine about the blood and those who served them as much as anyone else, yet she never ventured any opinion when the talk turned to Rena and Sita. She thought of them often, though. "You start on the other side, Rena," she ordered. "Well, do you want to be reported to Asanda for laziness yet again?" Before Falma, the shorter woman had been nearly overpowering in her self-assurance, but a muscle twitched in her pale cheek, and she gave Bethamin a sickly, obsequious smile before hurrying into the kennel's warren of narrow passages, patting at her long hair, as though afraid it might be disordered. Everyone except Rena's closest friends bullied her at least a little, repaying her former lofty pride. To do otherwise was to mark yourself out, something Bethamin avoided except in carefully chosen ways. Her own secrets were buried as deeply as she could bury them, and she held silent about the secrets no one knew she was aware of, but she wanted to fix in everyone's mind that Bethamin Ziami was the image of the perfect Sultan. Absolute perfection was what she strove for, in herself and in the Damani she trained. She set about her inspection briskly and efficiently, checking that the Damani had kept themselves and their individual kennels neat, making a short notation in her neat hand on the top page pinned to the writing board when one had failed to, and she did not dawdle, except to give out hard candies to a few who were doing particularly well in their training. Most of those she had been complete with greeted her entrance with smiles, even as they knelt. Whether from the Empire or from this side of the ocean, they knew she was firm yet fair. Others did not smile. For the most part, the Atha-an-Mier Damani met her with stony faces as dark as her own, or sullen anger they seemed to believe they were concealing. She did not mark their anger down for punishment, as some would have. They still thought they were resisting, but unseemly demands for the return of their garish jewelry already were a thing of the past, and they knelt and spoke properly. A new name was a useful tool with the most difficult cases, creating a break with what was done and gone, and they answered to theirs, however reluctantly. Reluctance would fade, along with scowls, and eventually they would hardly remember they ever had other names. It was a familiar pattern, and unfailing as sunrise. Some accepted immediately, and some went into shock at learning what they were. Always there were a handful who gave ground grudgingly over months, while with others one day it was shrieked protests that a terrible mistake had been made, that they could never have failed the tests, and the next day came acceptance and calm. The details differed on this side of the ocean, but here or in the Empire the end result remained the same. For two of the Damani she made notes that had nothing to do with neatness. Zushi, an Atha-an-Mier Damani even taller than she herself, was certainly marked for switching. Her dress was rumpled, her hair uncombed, her bed unmade. But her face was swollen from crying, and no sooner had she knelt than a new set of sobs racked her, tears streaming down her cheeks. The gray dress that had been fitted on her so carefully now hung loosely, and she had not been plump to begin with. Bethamin had named Zushi herself, and she felt a special concern. Unclipping the steel-nibbed pen, she dipped it and wrote a suggestion that Zushi be moved from the palace to somewhere she could be kept in a double kennel with the Damani from the Empire, preferably one experienced in becoming heart friends with newly collared Damani. Sooner or later, that always put an end to tears. She was not sure Suroth would allow it, though. Suroth had claimed these Damani for the Empress, of course. Anyone who owned a tenth so many personally would be suspected of plotting rebellion, or even accused outright. Yet she behaved as though they were her own property. If Suroth disallowed, some other way would have to be found. Bethamin refused to lose a Damani to despondency. She refused to lose a Damani for any reason. The second to receive a special comment was Tessie, and she expected no objections there. The Ilianer Damani knelt gracefully, hands folded at her waist as soon as Bethamin opened the door. Her bed was made, her extra gray dresses hung neatly on their pegs, her brush and comb were laid out precisely on her washstand, and the floor had been swept. Bethamon expected no less. Tessie had been neat from the start. She was fleshing out nicely now that she had learned to clean her plate. Other than treats, Damani's diets were regulated strictly. An unhealthy Damani was a waste. Tessie would never be decked in ribbons and entered in the competitions for the prettiest Damani, though. Her face seemed perpetually angry, even in repose. But today she wore a slight smile that Bethamon was sure had been in place before she entered. Tessie was not one she expected smiles from. Not yet. "How is my little Tessie feeling today?" she asked. "Tessie do feel very well," the Damani replied smoothly. Always before, she'd had to struggle to speak properly, and had earned her latest switching for outright refusal only yesterday. Fingering her chin thoughtfully, Bethamon studied the kneeling Damani. She was suspicious of any Damani who had called herself Aes Sedai. History fascinated her, and she'd even read translations from the myriad of languages that had existed before the consolidation began. Those ancient rulers reveled in their murderous, capricious rule, and delighted in setting down how they came to power and how they crushed neighboring states and undermined other rulers. Most had died by assassination, often at the hands of their own heirs or followers. She knew very well what Aes Sedai were like. "Tessie's a good Damani," she murmured warmly, taking one of the hard candies from the twist of paper in her belt pouch. Tessie leaned forward to receive it and kiss her hand in thanks, but the smile slipped a little, though it was back by the time she stuffed the red candy into her mouth. So, it was like that, was it? Pretending to accept in order to lull the Suldam was not unknown, but given what Tessie had been, very likely she was plotting escape as well. Back out in the narrow hallway, Bethamon wrote a strong suggestion that Tessie's training be redoubled, along with her punishments, and her rewards be made sporadic, so she could never be sure that even perfection would earn so much as a pat on the head. It was a harsh method, one she normally avoided, but for some reason it turned even the most recalcitrant Marath Damani into a supple Damani in a remarkably short time. It also produced the meekest of Damani. She disliked breaking a Damani's spirit, yet Tessie needed to be broken to the Idam so she could forget the past. She would be happier for it, in the end. Finishing ahead of Rena, Bethamon waited at the foot of the stairs until the other Suldam came down. "Take this to Asanda when you take yours," she said, thrusting her writing board at Rena before she cleared the final step. Unsurprisingly, Rena accepted the task as meekly as she had accepted the earlier order, and hurried away, eyeing the extra writing board as though wondering whether the pages held a report on her. She was a very different woman than she had been before Falma. Fetching her cloak and leaving the palace, Bethamon intended to return to the inn where she was forced to share a bed with 2 other Suldam, but only long enough to take some coin from her lockbox. The inspection had been her only duty today, and the rest of the hours were her own. For a change, instead of seeking extra assignments, she would spend them buying souvenirs. Perhaps one of those knives the local women wore at their necks, if she could find one without the gems they seemed to like on the hilt. And lacquerware, of course. That was as good here as any in the Empire, and the designs were so foreign. It would be soothing to shop. She needed soothing. The paving stones of the Malhara still glistened damply from the morning's rain, and a pleasant tang of salt filled the air, reminding her of the village on the Sea of Leh where she had been born, though the freezing cold made her clutch her cloak around herself. It had never been cold in Abu Nai, and she had never become accustomed to it, no matter how far she had traveled. Thoughts of home were no comfort now, though. As she made her way through the crowded streets, Rena and Sita filled her head to the extent that she bumped into people and once almost walked right in front of a merchant's train of wagons leaving the city. A shout from a wagon driver caught her attention, and she leaped back just in time. The wagon rumbled across the paving stones where she would have been standing, and the woman wielding the whip did not even glance at her. These foreigners had no idea of the respect due a Suldam. Rena and Sita. Everyone who had been at Falma had memories they wanted to forget, memories they would not talk about except when they drank too much. She did too, only hers were not about the shock of battling half-recognized ghosts out of legend, or the horror of defeat, or mad visions in the sky. How often had she wished she had not gone upstairs that day? If only she had not wondered how Tuli was doing, the Damani who had the marvelous skill with metals. But she had looked into Tuli's kennel, and she had seen Rena and Sita frantically trying to remove Idam from each other's necks, shrieking with the pain, wavering on their knees from the nausea, and still fumbling at the collars. Vomit stained the fronts of their dresses. In their frenzy they had not noticed her backing away, horror-stricken. Not simply horror at seeing Tu Suldam revealed as Maraf Damani, but her own sudden personal terror. Often she thought she could almost see Damani's weaves, and she could always sense a Damani's presence and know how strong she was. Many Suldam could. Everyone knew it came from long experience at handling the Idam. Yet the sight of that desperate pair roused unwanted thoughts, putting a different and frightening complexion on what she had always accepted. Did she almost see the weaves? Or did she really see? Sometimes she thought she felt the channeling, too. Even Suldam had to undergo the yearly testing until their 25th naming day, and she had passed by failing every time. Only there would be a new testing after Rena and Sita were discovered, a new testing to find the Marath Damani who somehow had evaded the first. The Empire itself might tremble before such a blow, and with the image of Rena and Sita burned into her brain, she had known with total certainty that after those tests, Bethamin Ziami would no longer be a respected citizen. Instead, a Damani called Bethamin would serve the Empire. The shame curdled in her still. She had placed personal fears ahead of the needs of the Empire, ahead of everything she knew to be right and true and good. Battle came to Falma and Nightmare, but she had not rushed to complete herself with the Damani and join the battle line. Instead, she had used the confusion to secure a horse and flee, to run as hard and as far as she could. She realized she had stopped, staring into a seamstress's shop window without really seeing what was on display inside. Not that she wanted to see. The blue dress with its lightning-marked red panels was the only one she had thought of wearing in years, and certainly she would not wear something that exposed her so indecently. Skirts swirling about her ankles, she walked on, but she could not shake Rena and Sita from her thoughts, or Suroth. Obviously Alwyn had found the collared pair of Suldam and reported them to Suroth, and Suroth had sheltered the Empire by protecting Rena and Sita, dangerous as that was. What if they suddenly began channeling? Better perhaps for the Empire if she had arranged their deaths, though killing a Suldam was murder, even for the high blood. 2 suspicious deaths among the Suldam would certainly have brought in seekers. So Rena and Sita were free, if it could be called that, when they were never allowed to be complete. Alwyn had done her duty and been honored by becoming Suroth's voice. Suroth had done her duty as well, however distasteful. There was no new testing. Her own flight had been for nothing, and if she had remained, she would not have ended up in Tanchico, a nightmare she wanted to forget even more than she did Falma. A squad of the Death Watch guards marched by, resplendent in their armor, and Bethamin paused to watch them pass. They left a wake through the crowd like a great ship under full sail. There would be joy in the city, in the land, when Tuan finally revealed herself, and celebrations as though she had just arrived. She felt a guilty pleasure at thinking of the Daughter of the Nine Moons so, as when she had done something forbidden as a child, though of course until Tuan removed her veil she was merely the High Lady Tuan, no higher than Suroth. The Death Watch guards tramped on, dedicated heart and soul to Empress and Empire, and Bethamin went in the opposite direction. Appropriately, since she was dedicated heart and soul to preserving her own freedom. The Golden Swans of Heaven was a grand name for a tiny inn squeezed between a public stable and a lacquerware shop. The lacquerware shop was full of military officers buying everything the shop contained. The stable was full of horses purchased in the lottery and not yet assigned, and the Golden Swans was full of Suldam, packed with them in fact, at least once night came. Bethamin was lucky to have only 2 bedmates. Ordered to accommodate as many as she could, the innkeeper pushed 4 and 5 into a bed when she thought they would fit. Still, the bedding was clean and the food quite good, if peculiar. And given that the alternative was likely a hayloft, she was glad to share. At this hour, the round tables in the common room were empty. Some of the Suldam living there surely had duties, and the rest simply wanted to avoid the innkeeper. Arms folded, frowning, Darnella Shoran was watching several serving women sweep the green-tiled floor industriously. A skinny woman with gray hair worn rolled on the nape of her neck and a long jaw that gave her a belligerent appearance. She might have been a Dursul dame in spite of the ridiculous knife she wore, its hilt studded with cheap red and white gems. Supposedly the serving women were free, but they jumped like property whenever the innkeeper spoke. Bethamin jumped slightly herself when the woman rounded on her. "You are aware of my rules concerning men, Mistress Ziami?" she demanded. After all this time, the slow way these people talked still sounded odd. "I've heard about your foreign ways, and if that is how you are, it is your business, but not under my roof. If you want to meet with men, you will do it elsewhere." "I assure you I have not been meeting men here or anywhere else, Mistress Shoran." The innkeeper frowned at her in suspicion. "Well, he came around asking for you by name. A pretty yellow-haired man. Not a boy, but not very old either. One of your lot, dragging his words out so you could hardly understand him." Making her tone placating, Bethamin did her best to convince the woman that she did not know anyone who met that description, and that she had no time for men with her duties. Both were true, yet she would have lied if necessary. The golden swans had not been commandeered, and 3 in a bed was much preferable to a hayloft. She tried to find out whether the woman might like some small gift when she went shopping, but the woman actually seemed offended when she suggested a knife with more colorful gems. She had not meant anything expensive, nothing in the way of a bribe. Not really. Yet Mistress Shoran seemed to take it so, puffing and frowning indignantly. In any case, she was not sure she succeeded in changing the woman's mind by a hair. For some reason, the innkeeper seemed to believe they spent all their free hours engaged in debauchery. She was still frowning when Bethamin started up the railless stairs at the side of the common room, pretending that she had not a thought in her mind beyond shopping. The man's identity did concern her, though. She certainly did not recognize the description. In all likelihood, he had come about her inquiries, but if that was the case, if he had been able to trace her here, then she had been insufficiently discreet. Perhaps dangerously so. Still, she hoped he came back. She needed to know. She needed to. Opening the door to her room, she froze. Impossibly, her iron lockbox sat on the bed with its lid thrown open. That was a very good lock, and the only key lay at the bottom of her belt pouch. The thief was still there, and oddly he was thumbing through her diary. How in the light had the man gotten past Mistress Shoran's surveillance? Paralysis lasted only an instant. Snatching her belt knife from its sheath, she opened her mouth to scream for help. The fellow's expression never changed, and he neither tried to run nor to attack her. He just took something small from his pouch and held it up where she could see it, and her breath turned to lead in her throat. Numbly she fumbled her knife back into its scabbard and held out her hands to show him she held no weapon and was not attempting to reach one. Between his fingers was a gold-edged ivory plaque, engraved with a raven and a tower. Suddenly she really saw the man, yellow-haired and in his middle years. Perhaps he was pretty, as Mistress Shoran had said, but only a madwoman would think of a seeker for truth in that fashion. Thank the light she had not recorded anything dangerous in her diary, but he must know. He had asked for her by name. Oh, light, he must know. "Close the door," he said quietly, returning the plaque to his pouch, and she obeyed. She wanted to run. She wanted to plead for mercy. But he was a seeker, so she stood there, trembling. To her surprise, he dropped her diary back into the lockbox and gestured to the room's single chair. "Sit. There is no need for you to be uncomfortable." Slowly she hung up her cloak and settled onto the chair, for once not caring how uncomfortable the strange ladder-like back was. She did not try to hide her shivers. Even one of the high blood, might quake at being questioned by a seeker. She had a small hope. He had not simply ordered her to accompany him. Perhaps he did not know, after all. "You have been asking questions about a ship captain named Iginan Sarna," he said. "Why?" Hope faltered with a thud she could feel in her chest. "I was looking for an old friend," she quavered. The best lies always contained as much truth as possible. "We were at Falmouth together. I don't know whether she survived." Lying to a seeker was treason, but she had committed her first treason in deserting during the battle at Falmouth. "She lives," he said curtly. He sat down on the end of the bed without taking his eyes from her. They were blue and made her want her cloak back. "She is a hero, a captain of the Green, and the Lady Eginan Tamarath now. Her reward from the High Lady Suroth. She is also here in Ebudar. You will renew your friendship with her, and report to me who she sees, where she goes, what she says, everything." Bethamin clamped her jaws to keep from laughing hysterically. He was after Eginan, not her. The light be praised, the light be praised in all its infinite mercy. She had only wanted to know if the woman still lived, if she had to take precautions. Eginan had freed her once, yet in the 10 years Bethamin had known her before that, she had been a model of duty. It had always seemed possible she would repent that one aberration, no matter the cost to herself, but wonder of wonders, she had not. And the seeker was after her, not... Possibilities reared up in front of her, certainties, and she no longer wanted to laugh. Instead, she licked her lips. How? How can I renew our friendship?" It had never been friendship anyway, merely acquaintance, but it was too late to say that now. "Tell me she's been raised to the blood. Any overture must come from her." Fear emboldened her, and panicked her as it had at Falmouth.
One
"Why do
second,
you need
everyone.
me to be your listener? You can take her for questioning any time you decide to." She bit the inside of her cheek to still her tongue. Light, she wanted nothing less than she wanted him to do that. Seekers were the secret hand of the Empress. Might she live forever? In the Empress's name he could put even Suroth to the question, or Tuon herself. True, he would die horribly if it turned out he had been in error, but the risk was small with Eginan. She was only of the low blood. If he put Eginan to the question... To her shock, rather than simply telling her to obey, he sat studying her. "I will explain certain things," he said, and that was a greater shock. Seekers never explained, so she had heard. "You are no use to me or the Empire unless you survive, and you will not survive if you fail to understand what you face. If you reveal a word of what I tell you to anyone, you will dream of the Tower of the Ravens as a respite from where you will find yourself. Listen and learn. Eginan was sent to Tanchico before the city fell to us, among other things as part of the effort to find Suldam who had been left behind at Falmouth. Strangely, she found none, though others did, like those who aided your own return. Instead, Eginan murdered the Suldam she found. I put the charge to her myself, and she did not bother denying it. She did not even show outrage or even indignation. As bad, she consorted in secret with Aes Sedai. He said the name flatly, not with the normal disgust, but rather like an accusation. When she departed Tanchico, she was traveling on a ship commanded by a man named Bail Domon. He made some disturbance at having his ship boarded and was made property. She bought him and immediately made him Sojin, so plainly he is of some importance to her. Interestingly, she had brought the same man to the High Lord Turak in Falma. Domon engaged the High Lord's regard to the extent that the fellow was often invited to converse with him. He grimaced. "Do you have wine or brandy?" Bethamin gave a start. "Iona has a flask of the local brandy, I think. It's a rough drink." He ordered her to pour him a cup anyway, and she obeyed hurriedly. She wanted to keep him talking, anything to delay the inevitable. She knew for a fact that Eginan had not been killing Suldam, yet her proof would condemn her to share and Sita's sour fate, if she was lucky, if this seeker saw his duty to the Empire as Suroth had. He peered into the pewter cup, swirling the dark apple brandy while she took her seat again. "The High Lord Turak was a great man," he murmured. "Perhaps one of the greatest the Empire has ever seen. A pity his Sojin decided to follow him into death. Honorable of them, but it makes it impossible to be sure Domon was in the band that murdered the High Lord." Bethamin flinched. Sometimes the blood died in others' hands, of course, but the word murder was never mentioned. The seeker continued, still peering into his cup without drinking. "The High Lord had ordered me to watch Suroth. He suspected she was a danger to the Empire itself. His own words, and with his death, he managed to gain command of the force. I have no evidence that he ordered his death, but there is much that Suroth brought a Damani to Thelma, a young woman who was Aes Sedai. Again, the name was flat and hard, and who somehow escaped the very day that Turok died. Suroth also has a Damani in her entourage that was once Aes Sedai. She might have been seen uncollared, but he shrugged, as though that were a thing of no moment. Bethamin's eyes popped. Who would uncollar a Damani? A well-trained Damani was a treat and a joy, but as well unleash a drunken Grolm. It seems very likely she has a Marath Damani hidden among her property too, he went on, just as if he were not listing crimes little lower than treason. I believe Suroth gave the order for Suldam, who managed to reach Tanchico, to be killed, perhaps in order to hide Aginan's meetings with Aes Sedai. You, Suldam, always say you can tell a Marath Damani at sight, correct? He looked up suddenly, and somehow she managed to meet those frozen eyes with a smile. His face could have belonged to any man, but those eyes. She was glad to be seated. Her knees were shaking so hard she was surprised it did not show through her skirts. It is not quite that easy, I'm afraid. She almost succeeded in keeping her voice steady. Surely you charge Suroth with Turok's murder? If he took Suroth, there would be no need to involve her or Aginan. Turok was a great man, but my duty is to the Empress. May she live forever, and through her to the Empire. He drank the brandy down in one long swallow, and his face became as hard as his voice. Turok's death is dust beside the danger facing the Empire. The Aes Sedai of these lands seek power in the Empire, a return to the days of chaos and murder when no man could close his eyes at night knowing he would wake, and they are aided by a venomous worm of treachery boring from within. Suroth may not even be that worm's head. For the Empire's sake, I dare not take her until I can kill the whole worm. Aginan is a thread I can follow to the worm, and you are a thread to Aginan. So you will renew your friendship with her, whatever it takes. Do you understand me? I understand, and I will obey. Her voice shook, but what else could she say? The light save her. What else could she say? Chapter 21. A Matter of Property. Aginan lay on her back on the bed with her hands raised, palms toward the ceiling and fingers spread. Her pale blue skirts made a fan across her legs, and she tried to lie very still so as not to wrinkle the narrow pleats too much. The way dresses confined movement. They must be an invention of the Dark Lord. Lying there, she studied fingernails too long for her to lay hands on a line without breaking at least half. Not that she had personally handled lines in quite a few years, but she had always been ready and able to, at need. Plain fool-headedness, Bale growled, poking at the blazing logs in the brick fireplace. Fortune prick me, Seahawk could sail nearer the wind and faster than any Shonjen ship ever made. There did be squalls ahead too, and... She listened only enough to know he had stopped grumbling about the room and taken up the same old argument. The dark-paneled chamber was not the best at the Wandering Woman, or even close, yet it met his requirements, excepting the view. The two windows looked out on the stable yard. A captain of the Green ranked with a banner general, but in this place most of those she outranked were aides or secretaries to senior officers of the ever-victorious army. Among the army, as at sea, being of the blood added little unless it was the high blood. The sea-green lacquer on the nails of her little fingers sparkled. She'd always hoped to rise, eventually perhaps to captain of the Gold, commanding fleets, as her mother had. As a girl, she had even dreamed of being named the Hand of the Empress at Sea, just like her mother, to stand at the left hand of the crystal throne, Sojin to the Empress herself, might she live forever, allowed to speak directly to her. Young women had foolish dreams. And she had to admit that once chosen for the Forerunners, she considered the possibility of a new name. Not hoping for it, certainly. That would have been getting above herself. Yet everyone had known the recovery of the stolen lands would mean new additions to the blood. Now she was captain of the Green, 10 years before she should have had any hopes of it, and stood on the slopes of that steep mountain that rose through the clouds to the sublime pinnacle of the Empress, might she live forever. She doubted she would be given command of one great ship, however, much less a squadron. Suroth claimed to accept her story, but if so, why had she been left sitting at Cantorin? Why, when orders finally came, were they to report here and not to a ship? Of course, there were only so many commands available, even for a captain of the Green. It might be that. She might have been chosen for a position near Suroth, though her orders said only that she was to travel to Embudar by the first available means and await further instructions. Maybe. The high blood might speak to the low without the intervention of a voice, but it seemed to her that Suroth had forgotten her as soon as she was dismissed after receiving her rewards, which also might mean Suroth was suspicious. Arguments that ran in circles. In any case, she could live on seawater if that seeker had given over his suspicions. He had no more, or she would already be in a dungeon shrieking. Yet if he was in the city too, he would be watching her, waiting for one misstep. He could not shed so much as a single drop of her blood now, as the Seekers were experienced at dealing with that minor difficulty. So long as he left it to watching, though, he could stare at her until his eyes shriveled. She had a stable deck under her feet now, and from here on she would take great care how she stepped. Captain of the Gold might no longer be possible, yet retiring as Captain of the Green was honorable. Well, Bale demanded, what about that? Wide and solid and strong, just the sort of man she'd always favored. He was standing beside the bed in his shirt sleeves, a frown on his face and his fists on his hips. Not a pose a Sojin should take with his mistress. With a sigh, she let her hands drop onto her stomach. Bale just would not learn how a Sojin was supposed to behave. He took it all as a joke or play, as though none of it were real. Sometimes he even said he wanted to be her voice, no matter how often she explained she was not of the high blood. Once she had had him beaten, and afterwards he had refused to sleep in the same bed with her until she apologized. Apologized? Hastily she ran through what she had half heard of his growling. Yes, still the same arguments after all this time, nothing new. Swinging her legs over the side of the bed, she sat up and ticked points off on her fingers. She had done it so often she could deliver them by rote. Had you tried to run, the Damani on the other ship would have snapped your masts like twigs. It was not a chance stop, Bale, and you know it. Their first hail was a demand to know whether you were Seahawk. By bringing you into the wind and announcing we were on our way to Cantorin with a gift for the Empress, may she live forever, I allayed their suspicions. Anything else, anything, and we would all have been chained in the hold and sold as soon as we reached Cantorin. I doubt we'd have been lucky enough to face the headsman instead. She held up her thumb. And last, if you had kept calm as I told you to, you would not have gone to the block either. You cost me a great deal. Several other women in Cantorin apparently had her same taste in men. They had pushed the bidding up extravagantly. Stubborn man that he was, he scowled and scrubbed at his short beard irritably. I do still say we could have dropped it all over the side, he muttered. That seeker had no proof I did have it aboard. Seekers do need no proof, she said, mocking his accent. Seekers do find proof, and the finding do be painful. If he was reduced to bringing up what even he had conceded long since, maybe she was finally nearing the end of the whole thing. In any case, Bale, you have already admitted there is no harm in Suroth having that collar and bracelets. They can't be put on him unless someone gets close enough, and I've heard nothing that suggests anyone has or will. She refrained from adding that it would not matter if someone did. Bale was not really familiar with even the versions of the prophecies they had on this side of the world sea, but he was adamant that none mentioned the necessity of the dragon reborn kneeling to the crystal throne. It might prove necessary for him to be fitted with this male Idam, but Bale would never see it. What is done, Bale. If the light shines on us, we will live long in the service of the Empire. Now you know this city, so you say? What is there interesting to see or do? There always do be festivals of some sort, he said slowly, grudgingly. He never liked giving up his argument, no matter how futile. Some may be to your taste, some not, I do think. You do be picky. What did he mean by that? Suddenly he grinned. We could find a wise woman. They do hear marriage vows here. He ran his fingers across the shaven side of his scalp, rolling his eyes upward as though trying to see it. Of course, if I do recall the lecture you did give me on the rights and privileges of my position, Sojin can only marry other Sojin, so you do need to free me first. Fortune prick me, you do no have a foot of those promised estates yet. I can take up my old trade and give you an estate soon enough. Her mouth fell open. This was not something old. This was very, very new. She had always prided herself on being level-headed. She had risen to command by skill and daring, a veteran of sea battles and storms and shipwreck. And right that moment she felt like a first voyage fingerling looking down from the main peak, panicked and dizzy, with the whole world spinning around her, and the seemingly inevitable fall to the sea filling her eyes. "It is not so simple," she said, surging to her feet, so he was forced to step back. Light's truth. She hated sounding breathless. "Manumission requires me to provide for your livelihood as a free man, to see you can support yourself." Light. Words flooding out in a rush were as bad as being breathless. She imagined herself on a deck. It helped, a little. "In your case, that means buying a ship, I suppose," she said, sounding unruffled at least. "And as you reminded me, I have no estates yet. Besides, I could not allow you to return to smuggling, and you know it." That much was simple truth, and the rest not really a lie. Her years at sea had been profitable, and if the gold she could call on was small gleanings to one of the blood, she could buy a ship, so long as he did not want a great ship, but she had not actually denied being able to afford one. He spread his arms, another thing he was not supposed to do, and after a moment she laid her cheek against his broad shoulder and let him enfold her. "It will be well thus," he murmured gently. "Somehow, it will be well." "You must not call me lass, Bale," she chided, staring beyond his shoulder toward the fireplace. It would not seem to come into focus. Before leaving Tanchico, she had decided to marry him, one of those lightning decisions that had made her reputation. Smuggler he might be, but she could have put a stop to that, and he was steadfast, strong, and intelligent, a seafarer. That last had always been a necessity to her. Only she had not known his customs. Some places in the Empire, men did the asking, and were actually offended if a woman even suggested. She knew nothing of enticing a man either. Her few lovers had all been men of equal rank, men she could approach openly and bid farewell when one or the other of them was ordered to another ship or promoted. And now he was Sojin. There was nothing wrong with bedding your own Sojin, of course, so long as you did not flaunt the fact. He would make up a pallet at the foot of the bed as usual, even if he never slept on it. But freeing a Sojin, casting him off from the rights and privileges Bale sneered at, was the height of cruelty. No, she was lying by avoidance again, and worse, lying to herself. She wanted wholeheartedly to marry the man Bale Domon. She was bitterly unsure she could bring herself to marry manumitted property. "As my lady do command, so shall it be," he said in a blithe mockery of formality. She punched him under the ribs, not hard, just enough to make him grunt. He had to learn. She did not want to see the sights of Ebudar any longer. She just wanted to stay where she was, wrapped in Bale's arms, not needing to make decisions, stay right where they stood forever. A sharp knock sounded at the door, and she pushed him away. At least he knew enough not to protest that. While he tugged on his coat, she shook out the pleats of her dress and attempted to smooth away the wrinkles from lying on the bed. There seemed to be a good many, despite how still she had been. This knock might be a summons from Suroth or a maid seeing whether she needed anything, but whoever it was, she was not going to let anyone see her looking as if she had been rolling about on the deck. Giving up the useless attempt, she waited until Bale had buttoned himself up and adopted the attitude he thought proper for a Sojin. Like a captain on his quarterdeck ready to shout orders, she thought, sighing to herself, then barked, "Come!" The woman who opened the door was the last she expected to see. Bethamin eyed her hesitantly before darting in and closing the door softly behind her. The Suldam took a deep breath, then knelt, holding herself stiffly upright. Her dark blue dress with its lightning-worked red panels looked freshly cleaned and ironed. The sharp contrast to her own dishevelment irritated Egina. "My lady," Bethaman began uncertainly, then swallowed. "My lady, I beg a word with you." Glancing at Bale, she licked her lips. "In private, if it pleases you, my lady." The last time Egina had seen this woman was in a basement in Tanchico, when she removed an idam from Bethaman and told her to go. That would have been enough for blackmail if she were of the high blood. Without doubt the charge would be the same as for freeing a Damani, treason, except that Bethaman could not reveal it without condemning herself, too. "He can hear anything you have to say, Bethaman," she said calmly. She was in shoal waters, and that was no place for anything except calm. "What do you want?" Bethaman shifted on her knees and wasted more time with lip-licking. Then suddenly words came out in a rush. "A seeker came to me and ordered me to resume our acquaintance and report on you to him." As if to stop herself babbling, she caught her underlip in her teeth and stared at Egina. Her dark eyes were desperate and pleading, just as they had been in that Tanchico basement. Egina met her gaze coolly. Shoal waters and an unexpected gale. Her strange orders to Abu Dar suddenly were explained. She did not need a description to know it must be the same man. Nor did she need to ask why Bethaman was committing treason by betraying the seeker. If he decided his suspicions were strong enough to take her for questioning, eventually Egina would tell him everything she knew, including about a certain basement, and Bethaman would soon find herself on the floor wearing an idam. Egina's only hope was to help Egina in evasion. He said, "Have a seat." Luckily there were 2 chairs, though neither appeared comfortable. "Bale, I think there is brandy in that flask on the drawered chest." Bethaman was so shaky that Egina had to help her up and guide her to a chair. Bale brought silver cups holding a little brandy, and remembered to bow and present Eginans first, but when he returned to the chest, she saw he had poured for himself as well. He stood there, cup in hand, watching them as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Bethaman stared at him, pop-eyed. "You think you are poised over the impaling stake," Eginan said, and the Soldan flinched, her frightened gaze jerking back to Eginan's face. "You are wrong, Bethaman. The only real crime I have committed was freeing you." Not precisely true, but in the end, after all, she had placed the male eyeball in Suroth's hands herself, and talking with Aes Sedai was not a crime. The seeker might suspect, after looking at the door in Tanchico, that he was a Sultan, charged with catching Marath Damani. At worst, that meant a reprimand. So long as he doesn't learn about that, he has no reason to arrest me. If he wants to know what I say or anything else about me, tell him. Just remember that if he does decide to arrest me, I will give him my name. A reminder could only guard against Bethaman when she saw a safe way out and behind. It would have to make me scream once. To her surprise, the Soldan began to laugh hysterically, until Eginan leaned forward and slapped her anyway. Rubbing her cheek sullenly, Bethaman said, "He knows near enough everything except the basement, my lady." And she began to describe a fantastical web of treason connecting Eginan and Bale and Suroth and maybe even Tuon herself, with Aes Sedai and Marath Damani and Damani who had been Aes Sedai. Bethaman's voice began to grow panicky as she darted from one incredible charge to another, and before long Eginan began sipping brandy. She was in command of herself. This was beyond shoal waters. She was riding close on a lee shore, and Soul Blinder himself rode that gale, coming to steal her eyes. After listening for a time with his own eyes growing wider and wider, Bale drank down a brimful cup of the dark raw liquor in one go. She was relieved to see his shock, and guilty at feeling relieved. She would not believe him a murderer. Besides, he was very good with his hands, but only fair at a sword. With weapons or bare-handed, the High Lord Turak would have gutted Bale like a carp. Her only excuse for even considering it was that he had been with 2 Aes Sedai in Tanchico. The whole thing was nonsense. It had to be. Those 2 Aes Sedai had not been part of any plot, just a chance meeting. Light's truth, they had been little more than girls, and near innocence at that. Too soft-hearted to accept her suggestion, they cut the Seeker's throat when they had the chance. A pity that. They had handed her the male Idom. Ice crept down her spine. If the Seeker ever learned she had intended disposing of the Idom the way those Aes Sedai suggested, if anyone learned, she would be judged as guilty of treason as if she had succeeded in dropping it into the ocean's depths. "Are you not?" she demanded of herself. The Dark One was coming to steal her eyes. Tears streaming down her face, Bethamin clutched her cup to her breasts as though hugging herself. If she was trying to keep from shaking, she failed miserably. Trembling, she stared at Aegeanin, or perhaps at something beyond her, something horrifying. The fire had not warmed the room very far yet, but sweat was beaded on Bethamin's face. "And if he learns about Rena and Sita," she babbled, "he will know for sure. He'll come after me and the other sultan. You have to stop him. If he takes me, I'll give him your name. I will." Abruptly, she lifted the cup to her mouth unsteadily and gulped the contents, choking and coughing, then thrust it out toward Bale for more. He did not move. He looked poleaxed. "Who are Rena and Sita?" Aegeanin asked. She was as frightened as the Sultan, but as always she kept her fear hard-reefed. "What can the Seeker learn about them?" Bethamin's eyes slid away, refusing to meet hers, and abruptly she knew. "They're Sultan, aren't they? And they were college just like you." "They are in Surath's service," the woman whimpered. "They are never allowed to be complete, though. Surath knows." Aegeanin rubbed at her eyes wearily. Perhaps there was a conspiracy after all, or Surath might be hiding what the pair were to protect the Empire. The Empire depended on Sultan. Its strength was built on them. The news that Sultan were women who could learn to channel might shatter the Empire to its core. It had surely shaken her, maybe shattered her. She herself had not freed Bethamin out of duty. So many things had changed in Tanchico. She no longer believed that any woman who could channel deserved to be collared. Criminals, certainly, and maybe those who refused oaths to the Crystal Throne, and she did not. Once her life had been made up of rock-solid certainties, like guiding stars that never failed. She wanted her old life back. She wanted a few certainties. "I thought," Bethamin began. She would have no lips left if she did not stop licking them. "My lady, if the Seeker suffers an accident, perhaps the danger would pass with him." Light, the woman believed in this intrigue against the Crystal Throne, and she was ready to let it pass to save her own skin. Aegeanin rose, and the Sultan had no choice but to follow. "I will think on it, Bethamin. You will come to see me every day. You are free. The Seeker will expect it. Until I make my decision, you will do nothing. Do you understand me? Nothing except your duties and what I tell you." Bethamin understood. She was so relieved that someone else was dealing with the danger that she knelt again and kissed Aegeanin's hand. All but bundling the woman out of the room, Aegeanin closed the door, then hurled her cup at the fireplace. It hit the bricks and bounced off, rolling across the small rug on the floor. It was dented. Her father had given her that set of cups when she gained her first command. All the strength seemed to have leached out of her. The Seeker had knitted moonbeams and happenstance into a strangling cord for her neck. If she was not named property instead, she shuddered at the possibility. Whatever she did, the Seeker had her trapped. "I can kill him." Bale flexed his hands, broad like the rest of him. "He be a skinny man, as I recall, used to everyone obeying his word. He will no be expecting anyone to snap his neck." "You'll never find him to kill, Bale. He won't meet her in the same place twice, and even if you followed her day and night, he might well be in disguise. You cannot kill every man she speaks to." Stiffening her spine, she marched to the table where her writing desk sat and flipped open the lid. The wave-carved writing desk, with its silver-mounted glass inkpot and silver sand jar, had been her mother's gift at that first command. The neatly stacked sheets of fine paper bore her newly granted sigil, a sword and a fouled anchor. "I will write out your manumission," she said, dipping the silver pen, "and give you enough coin to buy passage." The pen glided across the page. She had always had a good hand. Log entries had to be legible. Not enough to buy a ship, I fear, but it must do. You will depart on the first available ship. Shave the rest of your head, and you should have no trouble. It's still a shock seeing bald men not wearing wigs, but so far no one seems to. She gasped as Bale slid the page right out from under her pen. If you do free me, you can no give me orders, he said. Besides, you must ensure I can support myself if you do free me. He stuck the page into the fire and watched while it blackened and curled. A ship, you did say, and I will hold you to it. Listen well and hear, she said in her best quarterdeck voice, but it made no impression on him. It had to be the cursed dress. You do need a crew, he said right over her, and I can find you one, even here. What good will a crew do me? I don't have a ship. If I did, where could I sail that the Seeker couldn't find me? Bale shrugged as though that was not important. A crew first. I did recognize that young fellow in the kitchens, the one with the lass on his knee. Stop grimacing. There be no harm to a little kissing. She drew herself up, prepared to set him firmly to rights. She was frowning, not grimacing. That pair had been groping at one another in public like animals, and he was her property. He could not speak to her this way. His name be Matt Coffin, Bale went on, even as she opened her mouth. By his clothes he has come up in the world, and far. The first time I did see him, he did be in a farmer's coat, escaping Trollocs in a place even Trollocs be afraid of. The last time half the town of Whitebridge did be burning, close enough to, and a murdrile did be trying to kill him and his friends. I did no see for myself, but anything else be more than I can believe. Any man who can survive Trollocs and murdrile do be useful, I think, especially now. Some day, she growled, I'm going to have to see some of these Trollocs and murdrile you go on about. The things could not be half as fearsome as he described. He grinned and shook his head. He knew what she thought about these so-called shadow spawn. Better still, young Master Coffin did have companions on my ship, good men for the situation, too. One you do know, Tom Merlin. Eginon's breath caught. Merlin was a clever old man, a dangerous old man, and he had been with those two Aes Sedai when she met Bale. Bale, is there a conspiracy? Tell me, please. No one said please to property, not even to Sojin. Not unless they wanted something badly, anyway. Shaking his head again, he leaned a hand on the stone mantelpiece and frowned into the flames. Aes Sedai do plot the way fish swim. They could scheme with Suroth, but the question do be, could she scheme with them? I did see her look at Damani like they did
Be
the
right back,
mangy
everyone.
dogs with fleas and catching diseases. Could she even talk to an Aes Sedai? He looked up, and his eyes were clear and open, hiding nothing. I do tell this for true. On my grandmother's grave I do know of no plot. But did I know of 10, I still will no let that Seeker or anyone else harm you, whatever it do take. It was the sort of thing any loyal Sojin might say. Well, no Sojin she'd ever heard of would have been so straightforward, but the sentiments were the same. Only she knew he did not mean it that way. Could never mean it that way. Thank you, Bale. A steady voice was a necessity for command, but she was proud that hers was steady now. Find this Master Coffin and Tom Merlin if you can. Perhaps something can be done. He failed to bow before leaving her presence, but she did not even consider upbraiding him. She did not intend to let the Seeker take her either. Whatever it took to stop him. That was a decision she had reached before she freed Bethamin. She filled the dented cup to the brim with brandy, meaning to get so drunk she could not think. But instead she sat peering into the dark liquid without touching a drop. Whatever it took. Light she was no better than Bethamin, but knowing it changed nothing. Whatever it took.
Chapter 22. Out of Thin Air. The Amhara market was one of 3 in Far Madding where foreigners were allowed to trade, but despite the name, the huge square had nothing of the look of a market. No market stalls or displays of merchandise. A few mounted riders, a handful of closed sedan chairs carried by brightly liveried bearers, and the occasional coach with its window curtains drawn, made their way through a sparse yet bustling crowd that might have been seen in any large city. Most were well wrapped in their cloaks against the morning winds blowing in off the lake that surrounded the city, and it was the cold that made them hurry more than any urgent business. Around the square, as at the city's other two strangers' markets, the tall stone houses of bankers rubbed shoulders with slate-roofed stone inns where the foreign merchants stayed, and blocky windowless stone warehouses where their goods were stored, all jumbled in among stone stables and stone-walled wagon yards. Farmatting was a city of stone walls and slate roofs. This time of year, the inns were a quarter full at best, and the warehouses and wagon yards emptier than that. Come spring and the full revival of trade, though, merchants would pay triple for whatever space they could find. A round marble pedestal in the center of the square held a statue of Savion Amhara, 2 spans tall and proud in her fur-trimmed robes of marble, with elaborate marble chains of office around her neck. Her marble face was stern beneath the First Consul's jeweled marble diadem, and her right hand firmly gripped the hilt of a marble sword, its point resting between her slippered feet, while her raised left hand aimed a warning marble finger toward the tier gate some 3/4 of a mile away. Farmatting depended on merchants from Tyr and Ilion and Camelin. The High Council was ever wary of foreigners and their corrupting outland ways. One of the steel-capped street guards, in a leather coat sewn with overlapping square metal plates and a golden hand on his left shoulder, stood below the statue, using a long, limber pole to frighten away black-winged gray pigeons. Savion Amhara was one of the 3 most revered women in Farmatting's history, though none was known very far beyond the lake's shores. 2 men from the city were mentioned in every history of the world, though it had been called Aran Nadar when one was born, and Fel Morina for the other. But Farmatting did its fervent best to forget Rowland Darksbane and Urian Stonebow. In a real way, those 2 men were why Rand was in Farmatting. A few people in the Amhara glanced at him as he passed, yet nobody glanced twice. That he was from off was plain enough, with his blue eyes and his hair cut at the shoulder. Men here wore it sometimes hanging all the way down to the waist, either tied at the nape of the neck or held with a clip. His plain brown woolens were nondescript, though, no better than a moderately successful merchant might wear. And he was not the only one cloakless, in spite of the lake winds. Most of the others were fork-bearded Kandori, or Arafellan, with belled braids, or hawk-nosed Saldaeans, men and women who found this weather mild compared to borderland winter, but nothing about him said he was not a borderlander too. For his part, he simply refused to let the cold touch him, ignored it as he might have a fly buzzing. A cloak might get in his way, if he found his chance to act. For once, even his height did not attract notice. There were a good many very tall men in Farmatting, few of them natives. Manel Rochite himself was only a hand shorter than Rand, if that. Rand stayed well behind the man, letting people and sedan chairs sift between them and sometimes even hide his quarry. With his hair dyed black by herbs Nynaeve had provided, he doubted that the renegade Ashaman would notice him, even if the man turned around. For his part, he was not worried about losing Rochide. Most of the local men wore dull colors, with brighter embroidery about the chest and shoulders, and perhaps a jeweled hair clip for the more prosperous, while the outland merchants favored sober, unpretentious clothes, so as not to seem overly wealthy, and their guards and drivers bundled themselves in rough woolens. Rochide's bright red silk coat stood out. He strode across the square like a king, one hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword, a fur-edged cloak billowing behind him in the wind. He was a fool. That flapping cloak and the sword alike drew eyes. His waxed and curled mustaches named him a Morandian, who should be shivering like any normal human being, and that sword, a pure bull-goose fool. "You are the fool coming to this place," Lews Therin panted wildly in his head. "Madness, Madness! We have to get out! We have to! Ignoring the voice, Rand pulled his snug gloves tighter and kept a steady pace after Rochide. A number of the street guards in the square were watching the man. Foreigners were considered troublemakers and hotheads, and Mirandians had a prickly reputation. A foreigner carrying a sword always attracted the guards' attention. Rand was glad he had decided to leave his at the inn with Min. She nestled in the back of his head more strongly than Elaine or Avienda or Alana. He was only vaguely aware of the others. Min seemed alive inside him. As Rochide left the Amhara, heading deeper into the city, flights of pigeons sprang up from the rooftops, but instead of making the unerring swoops that normally would have taken them into the sky, birds crashed into one another, and some tumbled fluttering to the pavement. People gaped, including the street guards who had been watching Rochide so intently a moment before. The man did not look back, but it would not have mattered had he seen. He knew Rand was in the city without seeing the effects of a Taviran, or he would not have been there. Following Rochide onto the Street of Joy, really two broad straight streets, separated by a measured row of leafless, gray-barked trees, Rand smiled. Rochide and his friends probably thought themselves very clever. Perhaps they had found the map of the northern plains of Moredo replaced upside down in the racks in the Stone of Tyr, or the book on cities of the south, misshelved in the library of the Ace Daishar Palace in Chachin, or one of the other hints he had left behind. Small mistakes a man in a hurry might make, but any two or three together painted an arrow pointing to Farmatting. Rochide and the others had been quick to see it, quicker than he had expected, or else they had had help to point it out. Either way, it did not matter. He was not sure why the Mirandian had come ahead of the others, but he knew they would come, Torval and Deshiva, Gedwin and Kisman, to try finishing what they had bungled in Kyrian. A pity none of the Forsaken would be fool enough to come after him here. They would just send the others. He wanted to kill Rochide before the rest arrived, if he could. Even here, where they were all on an equal footing, it would be best to cut down the odds. 2 days Rochide had been in Farmatting, openly asking questions about a tall, red-haired man, swaggering about as if he had not a worry in the world. The man had seen any number who more or less met his description, but he still thought he was the hunter, not the hunted. "You have brought us here to die," Luce Theron moaned. "Being here is as bad as death." Rand shrugged uncomfortably. He agreed with the voice about that last. He would be as glad as Luce Theron to leave. Sometimes the only choice was between bad and worse. Rochide was ahead of him, almost within reach. That was all that mattered now. The Greystone shops and inns along the Street of Joy changed the farther Rand went from the Amhara market. Silversmiths replaced cutlers, and then goldsmiths replaced silversmiths. Seamstresses and tailors displayed embroidered silks and brocades instead of woolens. The coaches that rumbled over the paving stones now had sigils lacquered on the doors in teams of 4 or 6 matched for size and color, and more riders were mounted on prime Tyran bloodstock or animals as good. Sedan chairs borne by trotting bearers became almost as common as people afoot, and afoot, shopkeepers in coats or dresses heavily embroidered around the chest and shoulders were outnumbered by folk in livery as bright as that of the chair-bearers. Often as not, bits of colored glass now decorated men's hair clips, or occasionally pearls or richer gems, though few men walked whose wives could afford gems. Only the cold wind was the same, that and the street guards patrolling in threes, eyes alert for trouble. There were not so many as in the strangers' markets, yet as soon as one patrol strode out of sight, another appeared, and wherever a street wider than an alleyway met the Street of Joy, a stone watch stand stood with 2 guardsmen waiting at the foot in case the man atop spotted trouble. The peace was kept rigorously in Farmatting. Rand frowned as Rochide kept on along the street. Could he be headed for the Council's Plaza in the middle of the island? There was nothing there but the Hall of the Councils, monuments from more than 500 years earlier, when Farmatting had been the capital of Moreto, and the counting houses of the city's wealthiest women. In Farmatting, a wealthy man was one whose wife gave him a generous allowance, or a widower who had been provided for. Maybe Rochide was meeting dark friends, but if so, why had the man waited? Suddenly a wave of dizziness hit him, a murky face filling his vision for an instant, and he staggered against a passer-by. Taller than Rand himself, in bright green livery, the yellow-haired man shifted the large basket he was carrying and fended Rand off gently. A long, puckered scar ran down the side of his sun-dark face. Bowing his head, he murmured an apology and hurried on. Righting himself, Rand growled a curse under his breath. "You destroyed them already," Luz Theron whispered in his head. "Now you have someone else to destroy, and not before time. How many will we three kill before the end, I wonder?" "Shut up," Rand thought fiercely, but cackling derisive laughter answered him. It was not the encounter with an Aielman that upset him. He had seen many since coming to Farmatting. For some reason, hundreds of the Aiel who fled after learning the truth of their history had ended up there, attempting to follow the way of belief when they had no more idea of what that entailed, except that they were supposed to be lifelong Gaishain. He was not even worried about the dizziness, or whose face it was that he half saw when it struck. Ahead of him, a coach drawn by 6 greys clattered through the stream of sedan chairs, and hurrying folk in livery, and men and women darting in and out of the shop. But there was no sign of a red coat. He smacked a gloved fist into his palm in irritation. Going ahead blindly was idiotic. He might run right into the man, or at least be seen. So far, Rochide thought Rand did not know he was in the city, an advantage too important to squander. He knew where Rochide had his rooms, one of the inns that catered to foreign men. He could loiter outside tomorrow and wait for another chance. The others might arrive in the night, too. He thought he could kill any 2 together, or maybe even all 5, but it could not be done quietly. He would take injuries against 5, and at best, he would have to abandon his sword, which he was reluctant to do. It was a gift from Avienda. At worst, a flicker of fur-trimmed cloak caught his eye, fluttering in the wind as it vanished around a corner ahead, and he ran toward it. The guardsman at the watchstand there straightened, the man at the top taking his rattle from his belt. One of those at the bottom of the stand hefted his long cudgel, while the other lifted a catch-pole from where it had leaned against the watchstand's steps. The forked end was fashioned to catch and hold an arm, or a leg, or a neck, and the pole itself was belted with iron, proof against any sword or axe. They watched him closely with hard eyes. He nodded to them and smiled, then ostentatiously peered down the side street, searching the crowd there. Not a running thief, just a man trying to catch up to someone. The cudgel went back onto its belt hook. The catch-pole returned to the steps. He did not look at the guardsman again. Ahead, he got a glimpse of the cloak, and maybe a red coat.
Be right back, everyone.
As the wearer turned onto another street. Raising his hand as if to hail somebody, Rand sped after the man, dodging between people and street peddlers' barrows. Hawkers displaying pins or needles or combs on their trays tried to catch his attention, or anyone's, with their cries. Few people here wore embroidery, and a simple cord tying a man's hair was much more common than even the plainest clip. These streets were cramped at best, and crooked, a haphazard maze where cheap inns and narrow stone apartment buildings of 3 and 4 stories towered over the shops of butchers and candlemakers and barbers, tinsmiths and potters and coopers. Coaches would not have fit along these streets, and there were no sedan chairs either, no riders, and only a handful of liveried servants, carrying baskets on errands, but strolling and looking down their noses at everyone around them, except the street guards. Their patrols and watchstands were present even here. At last he got near enough for a clear view of the man he was following. Rochide had finally shown enough sense to pull his cloak about him, hiding his red coat and his useless sword, but there was no doubt of who he was. In truth, he seemed to be trying to avoid notice altogether now, slinking along the side of the street with his shoulder brushing the shop fronts. Abruptly, he looked around furtively, then darted into an alley between a tiny basket weaver's shop and an inn with a sign so dirty the name was completely obscured. Rand almost grinned, and wasted no time hurrying after him. There were no street guards or watch stands in Farmatting's alleyways. Those alleys were even more crooked than the streets Rand had just left, making a warren of their own through the interior of every block of the city, and Rochide was already out of sight. But Rand could hear his boots pounding on the damp, stony dirt. The sound bounced and multiplied between the windowless stone walls until he could hardly tell where it was coming from. But he followed, running along passages barely wide enough for 2 men abreast, if they were friendly. Why had Rochide come into this maze? Wherever he was going, he wanted to be there quickly, but he could not know how to use the alleys to get from one place to another. Abruptly, he realized the only boots he was hearing were his own stopped dead. Silence. From where he stood, he could see 3 more narrow alleys splitting off from the one he stood in. Barely breathing, he strained his ears. Silence. Almost, he decided to turn back, and then he heard a distant clatter from the nearest alley mouth, as though someone had accidentally kicked a rock against a stone wall in passing. Best to kill the man and be done. Rand turned the corner into the alley and found Rochide waiting for him. The Mirandian had his cloak thrown back again, and both hands on his sword hilt. The Farmatting peace bond wove Hilton's scabbard inside a net of fine wire. He wore a small, knowing smile. "You were as easy to bait as a pigeon," he said, beginning to draw his sword. The wires had been cut, then fixed so they appeared solid to a casual glance. "Run, if you want." Rand did not run. Instead, he stepped forward, slamming his left hand down on the end of Rochide's sword hilt, trapping the blade still half in its scabbard. Surprise widened the man's eyes, yet he still did not realize that pausing to gloat had already killed him. He moved back, trying to get room to complete his draw, but Rand followed smoothly, keeping the sword trapped, and pivoted from the hips, driving folded knuckles hard into Rochide's throat. Cardinal loudly, the renegade stopped trying to kill anyone. Staggering backwards, wide-eyed and scared, he clapped both hands to his throat and desperately tried to pull air through his pipe. Rand was already beginning the killing stroke beneath the breastbone when a whisper of sound came to him from behind, and suddenly Rochide's taunting took on new meaning. Backheeling Rochide, Rand let himself fall to the ground atop the man. Hard-swung metal clanged against a stone wall, and the man cursed.
Hey, D-Man, how you doing?
Sword, Rand let the motion of falling turn into a roll, pulling the blade clear as he tumbled over his own shoulder. Rochide gave a shrill
good morning to
scream
you too.
As Rand came up in a crouch, facing back the way he had gone. Rayfar Kisman stood gaping down at Rochide.
I hope you're
The
doing
blade
well,
had meant to
D-Man.
stab through Rand, instead driven into Rochide's chest. Blood bubbled on the Mirandian's lips. He dug his heels into the ground and bloodied his hands on the sharp steel as though he could push it out of him. Of only average height and pale for a tyrant, Kisman wore clothes as plain as Rand's, except for the sword belt. Hiding that beneath his cloak, he could have gone anywhere in Farmatting without being noticed. His dismay lasted only an instant. As Rand rose, sword ready in both hands, Kisman jerked his own blade free and did not look at his thrashing accomplice again. He watched Rand, and his hands shifted nervously on the long hilt of his sword. No doubt he was one of those so proud of being able to use the power as a weapon that he had disdained learning the sword. Rand had not disdained.
I'll try not to cough too
gave
much.
a last twitch and was still staring up at the sky. "Time to die," Rand said quietly, but as he started forward, a rattle sounded somewhere behind the tyrant, an incessant chattering, and then another. The street guards. "They'll take us both," sounded frantic. "If they find us standing over the forest, they'll hang us both. You know they will. He was afraid, at least in part. If the guards found them there, they would be hauled off to the cells beneath the hall of the councils. More rattles chattered, coming closer. The guards must have noticed 3 men ducking one by one into the same alley. Perhaps they had even seen Kisman's sword. Reluctantly, Rand nodded. The Tyran backed away cautiously, and when he saw Rand making no move to follow, he sheathed his blade and ran wildly, dark cloak flaring behind him. Rand threw his borrowed sword down atop Rochide's body and ran the other way. There were no rattles in that direction yet. With luck, he could be out in the street, blending into the crowds before he was seen. He had other fears than the noose. His gloves, showing the dragons that marked his arms, would be enough to prevent his hanging, he was sure. But the councils had proclaimed their acceptance of that odd decree Elida had issued. Once he was in a cell, he would remain there until the White Tower sent for him. So he ran as hard as he could. Melting into the crowd in the street, he heaved a sigh of relief. The street guard ran into the alley he had just. Holding his cloak close to hide his scabbarded sword, he moved with the flow of traffic no faster than anyone else, and slower than some. Nothing to draw a guardsman's eye. A pair of them passed with a trussed prisoner stuffed into a large sack, slung from a quarterstaff, carried on their shoulders. Only the man's head stuck out, his eyes wild and darting. Kisman shuddered. Burn his eyes, that could have been him. Him! He had been a fool to let Rochide talk him into this in the first place. They were supposed to wait until everyone had arrived, slipping into the city one by one to avoid notice. Rochide had wanted the glory of being the one to kill Althor. The Mirandian had burned with the desire to prove himself a better man than Althor. Now he was dead of it, and very nearly Rayfar Kisman with him. And that made Kisman furious. He wanted power more than glory, perhaps to rule Tyr from the stone, perhaps more. He wanted to live forever. Those things had been promised. They were his due. Part of his anger was because he was unsure they actually were supposed to kill Althor. The Great Lord knew he wanted to. He would not sleep soundly until the man was dead and buried. And yet... Kill him, the Mahale had ordered before sending them to Kyrian. But he had been as displeased that they were found out as that they had failed. Bar Matting was to be their last chance. He had made that as plain as polished brass. The Shiva had simply vanished. Kisman did not know whether he had run or the Mahale had killed him, and he did not care. Kill him, Demondred had commanded later, but he had added that it would be better they died than let themselves be discovered again. By anyone, even the Mahale, as if he did not know of Taim's order. And later still, Moradin had said, kill him, if you must, but above all, bring everything in his possession to me. That will redeem your previous transgressions. The man said he was one of the chosen, and no one was mad enough to make that claim unless it was true, yet he seemed to think Althor's belongings more important than his death, the killing incidental and not really necessary. Those two were the only chosen Kisman had met, but they made his head hurt. They were worse than Kyrianan. He suspected that what they left unsaid could kill a man quicker than a signed order from a High Lord. Well, once Torvald and Gedwin arrived, they could work out. Abruptly, something stung his right arm, and he stared down in consternation at the bloodstain spreading on his cloak. It did not feel like a deep cut, and no cutpurse would have slashed his forearm. He belongs to me, a man whispered behind him. But when he turned, there was only the crowd in the street, all going about their business. The few who noticed the dark stain on his cloak looked away quickly. In this place, no one wanted to be associated with even the smallest violence. They were good at ignoring what they did not want to see. The wound throbbed, burning more than it had at first. Releasing his cloak to the wind, Kisman pressed his left hand over the bloody slash in his sleeve. His arm felt swollen to his touch and hot. Suddenly he stared in horror at his right hand, stared as it turned as black and bloated as a week-old corpse. Frantically, he began to run, pushing people out of his way, knocking them down. He did not know what was happening to him, how it had been done, but he was sure of the result. Unless he could get out of the city, beyond the lake, up into the hills. He had a chance then. A horse. He needed a horse. He had to have a chance. He had been promised he would live forever. All he could see were people afoot, and they were scattering before his charge. He thought he heard guardsmen's rattles, but it might have been the blood pounding in his ears. Everything was going dark. His face hit something hard, and he knew he had fallen. His last thought was that one of the chosen decided to punish him. But for what, he could not have said. Only a few men were sitting at the round tables in the common room of the Crown of Moreto when Rand walked in. Despite the grand name, it was a modest inn with 24 rooms on 2 floors above. The plastered walls of the common room were painted yellow, and the men serving table here wore long yellow aprons. A stone fireplace at either end of the room gave it a marked warmth after outside. The shutters were bolted, but lamps hung on the walls took the edge off the dimness. The smells drifting from the kitchens promised a tasty midday meal of fish from the lake. Rand would be sorry to miss that. The cooks at the Crown of Moreto were very good. He saw Lan at a table by himself against the wall. The braided leather cord that held Lan's hair back drew sidelong glances from some of the other men, but he refused to give up wearing the hadori, even for a little while. He met Rand's gaze, and when Rand nodded toward the stairs at the back of the room, he did not waste time with questioning looks. He just set down his wine cup and rose, starting for the stairs. Even with just a small knife at his belt, he looked dangerous, but there was nothing to be done about that either. Several men at the tables glanced Rand's way, but for some reason they looked away hurriedly when he met their eyes. Near the kitchen, at the women's room, Rand stopped. Men were not allowed in there. Aside from a few flowers painted on the yellow walls, the women's room was not much fancier than the common room, though the stand lamps were painted yellow too, and the facings of the fireplace. The yellow aprons worn by the women who served table here were no different than those worn by the men in the common room. Mistress Nalhera, the slim, gray-haired innkeeper, was sitting at the same table as Min, Nynaeve, and Olivia, all of them chatting and laughing over tea. Rand's jaw tightened at the sight of the former Damani. Nynaeve claimed the woman had insisted on coming along, but he did not believe anyone could insist on anything with Nynaeve. She wanted Olivia along for some secret reason. She had been behaving mysteriously, as though working as hard as she could at being Aes Sedai, ever since he went back for her after leaving Elaine. All 3 women had adopted high-necked bar-matting dresses, heavily embroidered with flowers and birds in the bodice and shoulders and right up to their chins, though sometimes Nynaeve grumbled over them. No doubt she would have preferred stout 2 Rivers woolens to the finer materials she found here. On the other hand, if the red dot of the Kaisign on her forehead were not enough to draw every eye, she had decked herself out in jewelry as though attending a royal audience, a slim golden belt and a long necklace and any number of bracelets, all but one set with bright blue sapphires and polished green stones he did not know, and every finger on her right hand had a ring to match. Her great serpent ring was tucked away somewhere so as not to attract attention, but the rest drew 10 times as much. Many people would not have known an Aes Sedai's ring at sight, but anyone could see money in those gems. Rand cleared his throat and bent his head. "Wife, I need to speak with you upstairs," he said, remembering at the last moment to add, "if it pleases you." He could not make it more urgent than that, not to maintain the proprieties, but he hoped they did not linger. They might, if only to demonstrate for the innkeeper that they were not at his beck and call. For some reason, people in Farm Matting actually seemed to believe that women from off jumped when men told them to. Min twisted around in her chair to grin at him, as she did every time he called her. The feel of her in his hand and delight, suddenly sparkling with amusement. She found their situation in Farm Matting very amusing. Leaning toward Mistress Nalhera, Without taking her eyes from him, she said something in a low voice that made the older woman cackle with laughter and gave Nynaeve a pained expression. Olivia stood up, looking nothing like the subdued woman he vaguely remembered handing over to Taim. All those captured Suldam and Damani had been a burden he was glad to be free of. No more. There were threads of white in her golden hair, and fine lines at the corners of her eyes. Those eyes were fierce now. Well, she drawled, staring at Nynaeve, but somehow she made the word both a criticism and a command. Nynaeve glared up at the woman and took her sweet time in smoothing her skirts, but at least she stood. Rand waited no longer before rushing upstairs. Lan was waiting at the head of the stairs, just out of sight of the common room below. Quietly, Rand gave a bare-bones account of what had happened. Lan's stony face never changed expression. "At least one of them is done," he said, turning toward the room he shared with Nynaeve. "I'll get our things ready." Rand was already in the room he and Min shared, hurriedly pulling their clothes out of the tall wardrobe and stuffing them any way they would go into one of the wicker pack hampers, when she finally entered the room, followed by Nynaeve and Olivia. "Light, you'll ruin our things that way," Min exclaimed, shouldering him away from the hamper. She began removing garments and folding them neatly on the bed beside his piece-bonded sword. "Why are we packing?" she asked, but gave him no chance to answer. "Mistress Nohara says you wouldn't be so sulky if I switched you every morning." She laughed, shaking out one of the coats she did not wear here. He had told her he would buy her new, but she refused to leave the embroidered coats and breeches behind. "I told her I'd consider it. She likes Lan very much." Suddenly she pitched her voice high in imitation of the innkeeper. "A neat, mild-mannered man is much to be preferred over a pretty face, I always say." Nynaeve snorted. "Who wants a man she can make jump through hoops whenever she likes?" Rand stared at her, and Min's mouth fell open. That was exactly what Nynaeve did to Lan, and how the man put up with it was more than Rand could understand. "You think about men too much, Nynaeve," Olivia drawled. Nynaeve frowned, but instead of saying anything, she just stood there fingering one of her bracelets, a peculiar piece with flat golden chains stretching down the back of her left hand to rings on all 4 fingers. The older woman shook her head as though disappointed at not getting a rise. "I'm packing because we have to go and be quick about it," Rand said hastily. Nynaeve might be quiet for the moment, odd as that was, but if her face got any darker, she would be yanking her braid and shouting till no one could get a word in edgewise for hours. Before he finished the same account he had given Lan, Min stopped folding things and started replacing her books in the second hamper, hurriedly enough that she did not pad them with cloaks the way she usually did. The other 2 women stood staring at him as though they had never seen him before. In case they were not being as quick to see as Min, he impatiently added, "Rochide and Kisman ambushed me. They knew I was following. Kisman got away. If he knows this inn, he and Dashiva and Gedwin and Torval might all turn up here. Maybe in 2 or 3 days, or maybe in an hour or so." "I am not blind," Nynaeve said, still staring at him. There was no heat in her voice. Was she protesting just for the form of it? "If you want to hurry, help Min instead of standing around like a woolhead." She stared at him a moment longer and shook her head before leaving. Olivia paused in the act of following and glared at Rand. No, there was nothing subdued about her any longer. "You could get yourself killed like that," she said disapprovingly. "You have too much to do to get killed yet. You must let us help." He frowned at the door closing behind her. "Have you had any viewings about her, Min?" "All the time, but not the kind you mean. Nothing I understand." She wrinkled her nose at one of the books and set it aside. Small chance she would abandon a single volume of her not-so-small library. Undoubtedly she meant to carry that one and read it at the first opportunity. She spent hours with her nose in those books. "Rand," she said slowly, "you did all that. Killed one man and faced another, and... Rand, I didn't feel anything. In the bond, I mean. No fear, no anger, not even concern, nothing. I wasn't angry with him. Shaking his head, he began shoveling clothes into the hamper again. He just needed killing, that's all. And why would I be afraid? Oh, she said in a small voice. I see. She bent back to the books. The bond had gone very still, as if she were deep in thought, but there was a troubled thread worming through the stillness. Min, I promise I won't let anything happen to you. He did not know whether he could keep that promise, but he intended to try. She smiled at him, almost laughing. Light, she was beautiful. I know that, Rand. And I won't let anything happen to you. Love flowed along the bond, like the blaze of a noonday sun. Olivia's right, though. You do have to let us help somehow. If you describe these fellows well enough, maybe we can ask questions. You certainly can't search the whole city alone. We are dead men, Luz Theron murmured. Dead men should be quiet in their graves, but they never are. Rand barely heard the voice in his head. Suddenly he knew he did not have to describe Kisman and the others. He could draw them so well that anyone would recognize the faces. Except he had never been able to draw in his life. Luz Theron could, though. That should have frightened him. It should have. Isam paced the room, studying by the ever-present light of Tel-Anriad. The bed linens shifted from rumpled to neatly made between one glance and the next. The coverlet changed from flowered to plain dark red to quilted. The ephemeral always changed here, and he barely noticed anymore. He could not use Tel-Anriad the way the Chosen could, but here was where he felt most free. Here, he could be who he wanted to be. He chuckled at the thought. Stopping beside the bed, he carefully unsheathed the two poisoned daggers and stepped out of the unseen world into the waking. As he did, he became Luke. It seemed appropriate. The room was dark in the waking world. The single window let in sufficient moonlight for Luke to make out the mounded shapes of two people lying asleep beneath their blankets. Without hesitation, he drove a blade into each. They woke with small cries, but he pulled the blades free and drove them in again and again. With the poison, it was unlikely either would have had the strength to shout loudly enough to be heard outside the room. But he wanted to make this kill his own in a way that poison could not grant. Soon they stopped twitching when he thrust a blade between ribs. Wiping the daggers clean on the coverlet, he resheathed them with as much care as he had drawn them. He had been given many gifts, but immunity to poison or any other weapon was not among them. Then he took a short candle from his pocket and blew away enough ash from the banked coals in the fireplace to light the wick. He always liked to see the people he killed after, if he could not during. He had especially enjoyed those two Aes Sedai in the Stone of Tyr. The incredulity on their faces when he appeared out of thin air, the horror when they realized he had not come to save them, were treasured memories. That had been Isam, not him, but the memories were nonetheless prized for that. Neither of them got to kill an Aes Sedai very often. For a moment he studied the faces of the man and woman on the bed, then pinched out the candle's flame and returned the candle to his pocket before stepping back into Tel-Anriad. His patron of the moment was waiting for him. A man, he was sure of that much, but Luke could not look at him. It was not as it was with those slimy gray men whom you just did not notice. He had killed one of them once, in the White Tower itself. They felt cold and empty to the touch. It had been like killing a corpse. No, this man had done something with the power, so Luke's eyes slid away from him like water sliding down glass. Even seen at the corner of the eye, he was a blur. The pair sleeping in this room will sleep forever, Luke said. But the man was bald, the woman gray. A pity, the man said, and the voice seemed to melt in Luke's ears. He would not be able to recognize it if he heard it without the disguise. The man had to be one of the chosen. Few save the chosen knew how to reach him, and none of the men among those few could channel, or would have dared trying to command him. His services were always begged, except by the great lord himself, and more recently by the chosen, but none of the chosen Luke had met had ever taken such precautions as this. "Do you want me to try again?" Luke asked. "Perhaps. When I tell you. Not before. Remember, not a word of this to anyone." "As you command," Luke replied, bowing. But the man was already making a gateway, a hole that opened into a snowy forest glade. He was gone before Luke straightened. It really was a pity. He had rather looked forward to killing his nephew and the wench. But if there was time to pass, hunting was always a pleasure. He became Esom. Esom liked killing wolves even more than Luke did.
Chapter 23. To Lose the Sun. Trying to hold the unfamiliar woolen cloak tightly around her with one hand, trying not to fall out of the even more unfamiliar saddle, Shallan awkwardly heeled her horse forward and followed Harina and her swordmaster Moad through the hole in the air that led from a stable yard in the Sun Palace to... She was not sure where, except that it was a long open area. A clearing, was it called? She thought that was right. A clearing larger than a raker's deck, among stunted trees spaced out on hills. The pines, the only trees among them she recognized, were too small and twisted for any use but tar and turpentine. Most of the rest showed bare gray branches that made her think of bones. The morning sun sat just above the treetops, and if anything, the cold seemed more bitter here than it had in the city she had left behind. She hoped the horse did not misstep and pull her down onto the rocks that stuck up wherever patches of snow did not cover the rotting leaves on the ground. She distrusted horses. Unlike ships, animals had minds of their own. They were treacherous things to climb on top of. And horses had teeth. Whenever her mount showed his, so near to her legs, she flinched and patted his neck and made soothing sounds. At least she hoped the beast found them soothing. Cadsuane herself, garbed in unrelieved dark green, sat easily on a tall horse with a black mane and tail, maintaining the weave that made the gateway. Horses did not bother her. Nothing bothered her. A sudden breeze stirred the dark gray cloak spread over the back end of her mount, but she gave no sign of feeling the cold at all. The golden hair ornaments dangling around her dark gray buns swung as she turned her head to watch Shallan and her companions. She was a handsome woman, but not one you would notice twice in a crowd, except that her smooth face did not match her hair. Once you came to know her, it was too late. Shallan would have given much to see how that weave was done, even if it had meant being near Cadsuane, but she had not been allowed into the stable yard until the gateway was complete, and seeing a sail spread on the yard arm did not teach you how to set a sail, much less make one. All she knew was the name. Riding past, she avoided meeting the Aes Sedai's gaze, but she felt it. The woman's eyes made her toes curl, seeking a footing the stirrups could not give. She could see no way to escape, yet she hoped to find one through studying the Aes Sedai. That she knew very little about Aes Sedai she was readily willing to admit. She had never met one before sailing to Cairhien, and thought about them only to praise the light that she had not been chosen to become one. But there were currents among Cadsuane's companions, deep beneath the surface. Deep, strong currents could alter everything that seemed apparent on the surface. The four Aes Sedai who had come through right after Cadsuane were waiting on their horses at one side of the clearing, with 3 warders. At least Shallan was sure that Ivone was the fiery Alana's warder, and Tomas was stout little Veren's. But she also was sure she had seen the very young man who stayed so close to plump Daigyan's side wearing an Ashaman's black coat. Surely he could not be a warder, could he? Eben was just a boy. Yet when the woman gazed at him, her usual puffed-up pride seemed to swell further. Kumira, a pleasant-looking woman with blue eyes that could turn into knives when something interested her, sat her saddle a little to one side, studying young Eben so sharply it was a wonder he was not lying on the ground flensed. "I will not put up with this much longer," Harina grumbled, thumping her mare with her bare heels to keep it moving. Her brocaded yellow silks did not help her keep a good seat in the saddle any more than did Shallon's blue. She swayed and slid with the animal's movements, on the point of toppling to the ground at every step. The breeze gusted again, flipping the dangling ends of her sash about, making her cloak billow, but she disdained to control the garment. Cloaks were not much used in the ships. They got in the way and could tangle your arms and legs when you needed them for survival. Moad had refused one, trusting to the quilted blue coat he wore in the coldest seas. Nasuna Bihara, all in bronze wool, rode through the gateway looking around as if trying to see everything at once, and then Elsa Penfell, who wore a sullen expression for some reason and clutched her fur-lined green cloak tight. None of the other Aes Sedai seemed to bother much with sheltering themselves from the cold. "I may be able to see the Coromor," she says, Harina muttered, pulling at her reins until the mare turned toward the side of the clearing away from where the Aes Sedai were gathering. "May! And she offers this chance as though granting a privilege." Harina did not need to give a name. When Harina said "she" that way, like a jellyfish's sting, there could only be one woman she meant. "I have the right, bargained for and agreed. She denies me the agreed entourage. I must leave my sail mistress behind, and my attendants." Arian Boreleus appeared through the opening, as intent as if she expected to find a battle, followed by Beldine Nyram, who did not even look like an Aes Sedai. Both wore green, Arian completely, Beldine in slashes in her sleeves and skirts. Did that mean something? Likely not. Am I to approach the Coromor like a deck girl touching my heart to a sail mistress? When several Aes Sedai were together, you could see the smooth-faced agelessness clearly, so you could not say whether anyone was 20 or twice that, even if her hair was white. And Beldine simply looked a girl of 20, and that told no more than did her skirts. Am I to air my own bedding and wash my own linens? She turns protocol straight into the wind. I will not allow it. No more! These were old complaints, voiced a dozen times since last night, when Cadsuane laid down her conditions if they were to accompany her. Those conditions had been strict, but Harina had had no choice save to accede, which only added to the bitterness. Shallon listened with half an ear, nodding and murmuring the appropriate responses. Agreement, of course. Her sister expected agreement. Most of her attention was on the Aes Sedai, surreptitiously. Moad did not pretend to listen, but then he was Harina's swordmaster. Harina might be tight as a wet knot with everyone else, yet she gave Moad so much leeway anyone might have thought the hard-eyed, gray-haired man was her lover, especially since both were widowed. At least they might think it if they did not know Harina. Harina would never take a lover who stood lower than she, and now, of course, that meant she could take none. In any case, once they stopped their horses near the trees, Moad leaned an elbow on the tall pommel of his saddle, rested a hand on the long carved ivory hilt of the sword thrust behind his green sash, and openly studied the Aes Sedai and the men with them. Where had he learned to ride a horse? He actually looked comfortable. Anyone could tell his rank at a glance, from his 8 earrings of the heaviest weight and the knotting of his sash, even if he was not wearing his sword and matching dagger. Did Aes Sedai have no way to do the same? Could they truly be so disorganized? Supposedly the White Tower was like some mechanical contrivance that ground up thrones and reshaped them to its will. Of course, the machinery did seem to be broken now. "I said, where has she brought us, Shallon?" Harina's voice, like an icy razor, drained the blood from Shallon's face. Serving under a younger sibling was always difficult, but Harina made it more so. In private she was beyond cool, and in public she was capable of having a sail mistress hung up by the ankles, not to mention a wind finder. And since that young shore-bound woman Min had told her she would be mistress of the ships one day, she had grown ever sharper. Staring hard-eyed at Shallon, she raised her golden scent box as if to cover an unpleasant odor, though the cold killed all the perfume. Hurriedly, Shallon looked into the sky, trying to judge the sun. She wished her sextant were not locked away on white spray. The shore-bound were never allowed to see a sextant, much less see one being used, but she was uncertain it would have done her any good. These trees might be short, but she still could not make out a horizon. Close on to the north, the hills rose into mountains that slanted northeast to southwest. She could not say how high she was. There was far too much up and down about landside to suit her. Even so, any wind-finder knew how to make rough approximations, and when Harina demanded information, she expected to receive it. "I can only guess, Wave Mistress," she said. Harina's jaw tightened, but no wind-finder would present a guess as a firm position. "I believe we are 300 or 400 leagues south of Kyrian. More I cannot say." Any first-day apprentice using a string stick who gave a fix that loose would have been bent over for the deckmaster's starter, but the words chilled Shallon's tongue as she heard what she was saying. 100 leagues over the full turn of a day was good sailing for a raker. Moad pursed his lips thoughtfully. Harina nodded slowly, looking right through Shallon as though she could see rakers under full sail gliding through holes woven in the air with the power. The seas truly would be theirs, then. Giving herself a shake, she leaned toward Shallon, her eyes catching Shallon's like hooks. "You must learn this, whatever the cost. Tell her you will spy on me if she teaches you. If you convince her, she might, the light willing. Or at least you may get close enough to one of the others to learn it." Shallon licked her lips. She hoped Harina had not seen her jerk. "I refused her before, Wave Mistress." She had needed some explanation of why the Aes Sedai had held her for a week, and a version of the truth had seemed safest. Harina knew everything. Except the secret Varen had winkled out. Except that Shallon had agreed to Cadsuane's demands in order to hide that secret. The grace of the light be upon her, she regretted Ailiel, but she had been so lonely that she sailed too far before she knew it. With Harina, there were no evening talks over honeyed wine to soften the long months parted from her husband, Mishael. At best, many more months would pass before she could lie in his arms. With respect, why should she believe me now? "Because you want the learning." Harina chopped the air with one hand. "The shorebound always believe greed. You will have to tell some things, of course, to prove yourself. I will decide what each day. Perhaps I can steer her where I wish." Hard fingers seemed to dig into Shallon's scalp. She had intended to tell Cadsuane as little as she could get by with, and as seldom, until she found a way free of her. If she had to talk with the Aes Sedai every day, and worse, lie to her outright, the woman would pry out more than Shallon wanted, more than Harina wanted, much more. It was as certain as sunrise. "Forgive me, Wave Mistress," she said, with every ounce of deference she could find. "But if I may be allowed to say so—" She cut off as Serene Nemdal rode up and reined to a halt before them. The last of the Aes Sedai and warders had come through, and Cadsuane had let the gateway vanish. Coriel, a thin woman if pretty, was laughing and tossing her mane of black hair as she spoke to Quneera. Maurice, a tall woman with eyes bluer than Quneera's and a more than handsome face that was stern enough to give even Harina pause, was using sharp gestures to direct the 4 men leading pack horses. Everyone else was gathering reins. It seemed they were all getting ready to leave the clearing. Serene was lovely, though the absence of jewelry lessened her looks, of course, as did the plain white dress she wore. The shorebound seemed to have no joy of color at all. Even her dark cloak was lined with white fur. "Cadsuane, she has instructed me to be your attendant, Wave Mistress," she said, inclining her head respectfully. "I will answer your questions to the extent that I can, and help you with the customs as well as I know them. I realize you might feel discomforted being with me, but when Cadsuane commands, we must obey." Shallon smiled. She doubted the Aes Sedai knew that in the ships, an attendant was what the shorebound would call a servant. Harina would probably laugh and demand to know whether the Aes Sedai could clean linens properly. It would be good to have her in a good mood. Rather than laughing, though, Harina stiffened in her saddle as though her backbone had become a mainmast, and her eyes popped. "I feel no discomfort," she snapped. "I simply prefer to put any questions to someone else. To Cadsuane. Yes, to Cadsuane. And I certainly do not have to obey her or anyone. Not anyone, except the mistress of the ships." Shallan frowned. It was unlike her sister to sound scatter-witted. Drawing a deep breath, Harina continued in a firmer tone, though in a way just as oddly as before. "I speak for the mistress of the ships to the Ata Anmier, and I demand due respect."